Support and resistance. This is a very key concept to understanding in the markets. This can greatly help us increase the probability of a trade. I don't directly trade off of these levels, but pairing this with other confluences in the market will greatly increase our probability of having a winning trade. So it's just important to get these down. We're going to cover a few different types of support and resistance. There's horizontal support, we have trend support, and we also have psychological zones that potentially might be support and resistance zones. So we're going to cover all that, and then in the next video, I'm going to go into depth on how we can understand confirmations depending on if a support zone is getting flipped into resistance and vice versa. So first off, we'll just draw a very simple example of a horizontal support and resistance zone. So I'm just going to draw two areas. You can think of support like a floor. Every time we come to the floor, we have a higher chance to bounce off of it, and every time we come into resistance, we have a higher chance to reject off of it. Not saying that every time we come into these zones, it'll happen, but the probability is higher. So first off, we have our region of support and our region of resistance. So every time price would get to the support, it would bounce, and every time price gets to the resistance, we would reject. And one thing to note is that while I am marking these zones out with a line, they are more arbitrary than this, and usually as a beginner, it would be more helpful to mark these out with a box, because they're not going to tap the lines exactly every time. They might get close, like something like this or something like this. So we can go ahead and highlight this with a box as well. This would be our region of support. We can highlight this in green, and we can have our region of resistance and highlight this in red. So pretty much every time we come closer to this green area, we have a higher chance of bouncing, and every time we come to this red area, we have a higher chance of rejecting. This is just a pretty simple version of some horizontally trading support and resistance. We can see that the market is just going horizontal. Now we can also have zones of support and resistance in a trending market. So meaning that we're having bullish or bearish market structure forming with these higher highs and higher lows, or the other way around, like you just learned in our previous video about market structure. Swing points also come into very key play here, because swing points are good areas to target for support and resistance. So let's just go over a trending market. We can have some higher highs and higher lows, like so. And you'll see this so much on the charts. We'll go into some examples in a second, like this, and we can just draw our lines like this, draw our lines like this. We'll also do the rectangles, but essentially this is our zone of support. It's not staying in the same price as it was down here with this horizontal support zone. It is actually getting higher, along with the zone of resistance is also getting higher, but price is still trading between these two lines, just in a vertical or trending market. Not vertical exactly, but you get the point, it's going up. So we can use a rotated rectangle and just highlight out the zone of support, and we also have our zone of resistance. Now right here, it's not tapping exactly, but just the higher we get into the zone of resistance, the higher chance that we would have to reject. And of course, it's not as simple as this, but this is just key to understanding for the concept of support and resistance. So these are pretty much the two things that we're going to cover on the charts today, and we might go into some more depth in another video, but let's just find some areas of support and resistance on the Bitcoin chart. So I'm here on the weekly time frame, and I'll just go over something very, very simple right here. So I'll just scale into the 3-day. So we can clearly see that in this region right here, Bitcoin is trending down. This is very tight, trending down, but it's still trending down. So we can see that every time price came down into this zone, it bounced, and every time price came into this zone, it rejected, until we ended up breaking up higher. But for the time being, within this little consolidation zone, we had our zone of support like so, so more likely to bounce, and then we had our zone of resistance, more likely to reject. There's just one example of this. Now, let's go into another example. So, this is enough. Okay. So also we can use swing points as key areas of support and resistance. So like I said in the last video about all-time highs being very key levels in the market, we can use this on Bitcoin as a perfect example. So we had the first initial all-time high put in about April of 2021. And then we had the second top right here in about November. So this zone right here was this zone right here was a very key level of resistance for Bitcoin. It rejected twice, and both times when it rejected, it had sharp moves to the downside. So clearly this is a zone of resistance for Bitcoin. Hold up, dude, hold up. Okay, so clearly this is a zone of resistance right here for Bitcoin. Then we start to trend down, and maybe we are like around here. I can turn on the replay mode so it's a little less confusing, but let's just say this was the price action that we are currently looking at on Bitcoin. This zone right here would be the first area, if I were just to look at this chart, where I would mark out as a zone of resistance. So we can just draw this box across, and we can expect that once price comes into the zone, it would reject or at least slow down its momentum from which we came up into it. So we can now turn off the replay. And now that you see how we mark out the zone, we have violent moves to the upside on Bitcoin. Most of these candles are just going vertical, especially like here. These weekly candles are getting very, very big and very, very fast. We are just having a fast move to the upside. And then once we reach into this zone of resistance, you can see how these weekly candles get a lot smaller, get a lot tighter, and we start to reject. We had about a 30% rejection from the zone of resistance. So we can see that it didn't sharply decline right after hitting this zone, and it makes sense. It's not just going to do the same thing it did before, because that just really never happens in the markets. So we just had a shallower move like so. We didn't have something like this, but we had a shallower move, and this zone of resistance did play a role in this price action. And then ultimately, after breaking through this with these huge weekly candles, we can see that now this once zone of resistance turned into support for Bitcoin right here on this retest before continuing higher. So this is a perfect example of how to use key swing points as levels of resistance and how it slowed down price, and then once eventually breaking through it, it turned into support for this zone for the next move up on Bitcoin. Now, if it wasn't going to be turned into support, we'll go into that in another video, but just quickly, price probably would have chopped down even more and then rejected off of this resistance zone again before moving lower, but that did not happen. So let's even go into some more examples. We can go on GBP, I already had this marked down. So we can go on GBP USD on the quarterly time frame, and we see that we have a key swing point right here. We can just go ahead and mark this out with one of our rays, but we can see that every time price came down to the zone, it acted as a region of support, like so. We can highlight this in green. So every time price came into this region of support, we had sharp moves to the upside. So clearly this is a key level of support on the pound versus the dollar. And then we can actually see that this zone of support got flipped and started to become a zone of resistance. And then every time we moved up into the zone, we had some sharp rejects. So you can see how the majority of the time, key support levels frequently turn into resistance, and key resistance levels frequently turn into support. Let's try and find an example of where a resistance level turned into support. We just found one on Bitcoin, like I showed you, but maybe there's another. Well, we can just quickly look here. Yeah, I mean, this very short time frame here, this one's a lot more confusing on Solana, but we can see that we clearly have this zone right here of support, like so. Yeah, this was a very crucial zone for Solana. So we had this initial zone where we were just rejecting off this key cluster right here. And then we flipped this and used it as support before flipping it again, using it as resistance, resistance, and then resistance, resistance. So we can see how these zones flip each other a lot and are very key in the market to finding where price might want to reject or where price might want to bounce. Now let's try and find another example of it trending. I have one here labeled out on XRP, but pretty much XRP is in a downtrend, clearly has bearish market structure. We can go ahead and highlight this out with a path real quick if you are struggling to see this. Clearly bearish market structure on XRP. While we are in this downtrend, we have this region of resistance that is getting lower, but price is still rejecting off of it, but we're just getting lower. Same thing for the support. Price is still bouncing off of it, but it's just getting lower until we break out of one of these zones. And then that's the other thing I want to talk about. I'm not going to go too much into depth, but usually once you break out of one of these sides, you can expect then for that region to flip. So and maybe we break out of this resistance zone, and then we could expect this zone of resistance to now act as support for a move higher. We're going to go into confirmation closes in the next video. It's very key to figuring out what actually is going to be a bounce at support or when it would genuinely just be a breakdown. That's pretty much all I have for support and resistance. It's a pretty key concept to understanding. We also have psychological levels real quick, like a very psychological level is $100,000 on Bitcoin, or just round numbers like $250 SOL, but these levels are more arbitrary and don't matter as much as the ones that we're seeing actually right here on the charts. So go find examples of zones of support and resistance in horizontal markets and also trending markets, and just mark them out, get comfortable, see where price is rejecting, see where price is bouncing, and just get familiar, and I'll see you in the next video.